Hi everyone, it's Mrs. Bustamante. Today we're going to continue talking about cellular respiration. So the overall equation for cellular respiration, which you saw a little bit ago, is that you take glucose and you take 6 molecules of oxygen and you combine them and they're going to give off 6 molecules of carbon dioxide, 6 molecules of water, and 36 to 38 ATP molecules. And why this number varies, we'll talk about in a little bit. But it's kind of a complicated process. And just remember, like back in photosynthesis, we talked about you had to go through lots of different processes in order to get out your overall glucose and oxygen. So you actually made some other things and used some other things along the way. Well, cellular respiration is the same way. We're going to talk about it in 3 big steps. Those 3 big steps we're going to talk about are glycolysis, the Krebs cycle, and then the electron transport chain. And we're also going to talk about fermentation a little bit too. So there's something important we have to know when we start talking about cellular respiration. We have to know what it's called if we have oxygen, and then what if it's called if we don't have oxygen. Overall, cellular respiration is an aerobic process, we say. And aerobic means that something requires the presence of oxygen, meaning you have to have oxygen there in order for it to function, in order for it to make the products that you want. Some steps, however, within the process of cellular respiration do not require the presence of oxygen, and we call that part anaerobic, which means without oxygen. A way I like to think about this is think about if you're training for some sort of aerobic activity, or back in like the 80s, they used to have aerobics classes, right? Where you would go and go and go and go. And the point wasn't to lift a really huge, heavy amount, but it was to continue going for as long as you can, which means you have to breathe a lot. You need a lot of oxygen to do that. An anaerobic activity or anaerobic exercise is more like weightlifting in some senses, or strength training, where you're really trying to lift maybe something really heavy once or twice, but you're not trying to do lots of reps, so you don't feel like you're out of breath in the same way that you do if, say, you went running for 50 minutes, something like that. So it's really important that we know aerobic is with oxygen and anaerobic is without oxygen. We're going to use those terms to describe parts of cellular respiration as we move through the class. So where does cellular respiration take place? Well, it really occurs in 2 different parts of the cell. Glycolysis, our first part, occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, and that'd be like your gooey jelly-like material, right, that surrounds all your organelles. And then the Krebs cycle, or the electron transport, and the electron transport chain take place in our mitochondria. And remember that plants and animal cells both have mitochondria, so they're both going to undergo cellular respiration, and in any type of eukaryotic cell. And you remember back when we were talking about cell organelles, we talked about that everyone knows the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell, and you know how I love that. But we learned that it's called the powerhouse of the cell because it makes ATP, what the cell uses for energy. So now we're really going to start to get into how does this mitochondria become the powerhouse of the cell? How does it really make that ATP that the cell needs? So just a review of the mitochondria structure, it has a smooth outer membrane, and then it has this folded inner membrane. And these folds we call the cristae or cristea, sometimes you'll hear it called. And then in between them is some space, and we call this the matrix or the inner matrix space. And mitochondria, also something kind of unique about them, is that they actually have their own DNA. It's thought that it's passed down through your mother, so we could trace mitochondrial DNA through your family history based on your mother. It's just kind of an interesting fact, and it's used oftentimes to talk about evolutionary standpoints. How do we evolve? How do we trace history? So just to give you a little preview, the next time we're going to start to talk about cellular respiration in detail. What are those 3 parts and what do they do? And remember, our first part is going to be glycolysis. We're going to learn that it's anaerobic. It does not require oxygen. Our second part is going to be the Krebs cycle. It's aerobic and it requires oxygen. And then our third part will be the electron transport chain. It's also aerobic and it requires oxygen. And we're going to start to look at it as this, like this. This is the process of cellular respiration. We have glycolysis, it's going to happen in the cytoplasm, and then we're going to have the Krebs cycle and the electron transport chain that happen in this place called the mitochondria. And we're going to talk more in detail about how do we get these different numbers of ATP throughout the process, right? How do we take in glucose and go through a process called glycolysis, and the cytoplasm gets 2 ATP out. We're going to move some electrons carried by NADH to the electron transport chain, and also we're going to make this thing called pyruvic acid. It's going to go to the Krebs cycle. When it processes through the Krebs cycle, it's going to give us a little bit more ATP, and it's going to give off our carbon dioxide that we know from our overall big equation. It's also going to give us some NADH and FADH2s that go on to our electron transport chain, and we're going to get out 34 ATP, which is where we see the bulk of it, right? And you'll notice that it describes in here where, even in the mitochondria, these things are happening. So we don't have to know all that quite yet, but that's kind of our big picture. That's where we're going. That's what we're going to try and explain throughout this unit about cellular respiration.